We're very excited to get started with TILclimate's first live show, and I just want you to welcome your host, Laur Hesse Fisher.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Today I Learned Climate. I'm your host, Laur Hesse Fisher from the MIT Environmental Solutions Initiative, and this is our first live show. Woo! I'm joined here with a live audience, and we're in the beautiful MIT Museum. Isn't this a lovely, lovely space in the Phil Sharp room, as we have just discussed? And I want to give a big shout out to the MIT Climate Nucleus, which is a faculty committee in charge of overseeing the implementation of MIT's Climate Action Plan for the decade, called Fast Forward. They supported this event as part of MIT's Earth Month series. And I encourage you to go online to climate.mit.edu/events. There are events happening tonight and tomorrow, the rest of this week, and next week, all centered around Earth and the environment. So with that being said, let's jump in. You probably know by now that last year the US passed a very big piece of legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, as we'll be referring to it today. And it included the United States' largest investments in slowing climate change, well, ever. That bill was one of three that together mark America's biggest swing at tackling climate change. So today we're going to look at those three bills as a set and try to understand, well, what's the strategy here? And collectively, what do they achieve and how do they plan to go about it? And then what's next? Which brings me to the very special guest that I am pleased to be sharing the stage here with. Could you please share your name, your title and MIT affiliation, and what you've been up to the last couple of years?
Sure. My name is Liz Reynolds. I'm a lecturer in MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning. I'm also a partner in the investment firm Unless, which is focused on industrial transformation. And I think most important for this conversation, until last fall, I was Special Assistant to the President for Manufacturing and Economic Development at the National Economic Council at the White House. And in that job, I can say it began and ended focused on supply chain challenges. But in between, we had a lot of great work on national manufacturing strategy, R&D strategy, and our broader industrial strategy, which we'll be talking about today.
Yes, great. Well, Dr. Reynolds, thank you, and welcome to Today I Learned Climate.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So I already mentioned the IRA. What are the other two bills that we're talking about today?
Well, I think the first that we should focus on is the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which was passed in November of 2021. So it's been around for just over a year. And while, of course, that is a significant investment in our physical infrastructure, whether that's roads, bridges, airports, ports, rail, all of what you might think of as physical infrastructure, water, broadband as well. It also, I think, for a lot of people, it's not well understood that it actually had a lot of investment for our energy infrastructure, close to $100 billion, focused on things like the demonstrating technologies at scale, creating green banks, providing basically power grid and electrical grid infrastructure investment, a significant amount of funding that along with the IRA is supporting our energy agenda.
Great, and there's another one too that we're talking about.
And of course, the next one that was passed last summer was also the CHIPS and Science Act. Folks probably are familiar with the CHIPS part of that, which is a focus on investing close to $52 billion in our semiconductor production capabilities in this country. Semiconductors are behind almost every tool and every gear, every appliance, everything we use today. And so the CHIPS Act was really a focus to say, during the pandemic, what we saw was a real vulnerability in our ability to obtain semiconductor chips to the point where about a third of inflation in 2022 was driven by constraints on the auto industry because they couldn't get semiconductor chips. And so this is an effort to try and build some capacity in the country for that in both advanced and legacy chips. But the important part of that also, I think, to this broader conversation is the Science Act part of the CHIPS and Science Act. which was an authorization of close to $200 billion on building and investing in our R&D capabilities in the U.S. And MIT had a lot to do in shaping that act. It focuses on investments in particular technologies. We actually, for the first time, have named 10 plus technologies that really we think are critical to the country's future. Those include from artificial intelligence to advanced manufacturing and to this conversation, advanced energy efficiency as well as material science. It also involves investments in regional specialization, so regional tech hubs. How can we develop tech hubs outside of Boston, San Francisco, et cetera, to build our regional capabilities? And it basically is a way of also moving the U.S. from not just R&D, but also into later stage sort of demonstration and deployment with the creation of a new directorate at the NSF, so that we understand that we have always had strong R&D. How do we pull some of that R&D and think about the partnerships and what happens on the ground that helps us transition, for example, to a clean energy economy?
All right, well, great. So we'll be talking about many of those elements in more detail throughout today's event. We didn't really cover the IRA, though, I'm realizing. So can you give us a quick overview of the IRA?
So the IRA is an extraordinary piece of legislation, and as you said, the most significant investment the country has made in fighting what is essentially an existential threat to our country, but to the world in terms of addressing climate change. It's about $380 billion represented in mostly tax credits. So 3/4 of that is through tax credits, which are about trying to incent the private sector to invest in the technologies and the adoption of technologies that will help us meet our climate goals over time. So while it has that largely a significant amount around tax credits, it also includes significant investment in loans to the Loan Program Office, where we're investing long-term loans for companies that are trying to scale their technologies in the country and build out facilities. It also involves funding for a green bank, a regional green bank support. And green banks, of course, have existed in this country. They certainly exist in Europe, but we haven't really...
What are green banks?
Well, it's essentially, you can think of it as a development bank focused on climate.
Okay, and what's a development bank?
Okay, so a development bank would be a bank that is not looking for perhaps the highest market return on its investment. It's looking for a return, for sure, but it's taking into account social goals, not just private goals. So we have a goal as a country to try and invest in and grow our renewable energy infrastructure. These are banks, and there's one, certainly one in Connecticut and elsewhere. These are banks that are going to provide sometimes a long-term funding that regular projects wouldn't be able to get if they were trying to get the highest market return.
Okay, got it. So there are certain things that fall under the category of green that these banks focus on investing in.
That's right.
And then what is the IRA, how does it support the development?
So it's providing funding to support a network of these banks or a network of funding that will help regions. Our whole energy system is based on regional grids of sorts, right? We rely on hydro, and others rely on other sources of energy. This is a way in which often energy systems are built from the region up. This is how we organize our energy grids, if you will. And so a regional approach to this makes sense because different regions are going to have different strategies for building out their renewable energy capacity.
Okay, so we talked about the IRA, how it, 3/4 of it is around tax credits to incentivize the private sector, the green banks, the loans for businesses. Anything else that is important to mention as part of the IRA?
I guess I would say more broadly, I'd make the point that and whether it's in the IRA or coming out of the infrastructure bill, that along with investments for private sector and along with grants and other ways in which we're pushing money out into the field for public-private partnerships, there's also an institutional element to this. So there's a new Office of Demonstration at the Department of Energy that is focused on, again, with $20+ billion, focused on taking technologies that have moved beyond out of the lab. They're perhaps in pilot production, but really need to be demonstrated at scale. And so we'll have a whole new office and funding that's focused on that. There's a new Office of Energy and Transportation, because we know transportation is so critical to our goals in reducing greenhouse gases that we now have an office between energy and transportation who are working collaboratively on that topic. DOE also has set up a manufacturing and energy supply chain office, because we know also that we are building out, in many ways, supply chains for the first time in this country. And we have had supply chain constraints. I can speak from personal experience on that over the last couple of years.
And we've experienced it ourselves,
and we've experienced
too.
it. So how are we going to build out those supply chains? What is the strategy? What can we be doing, again, from a public-private perspective to doing that? So I think there's all these dimensions in which we're really, I think, building this, not only providing wind at our backs through these tax credits and funding, but also building an institutional infrastructure for taking this forward over the next decade.
Okay, so we covered a lot. You mentioned a lot of different things that are included in all these bills. Why are we talking about them as a set? How do they relate to each other? I mean, was that intentional? Can you just give us the kind of the big picture look at these three bills?
They each have their own particular history. We've been talking about an infrastructure bill for a long time in this country. So in and of itself, you might just stop there and say, pat yourself on the back and say, we got that, again, passed with bipartisan support. But I think what they all are speaking to is a reinvestment in the country's industrial infrastructure. We have to rebuild a lot of what has sort of deteriorated over the decades. So physical infrastructure is one of those things. But even to think about decarbonizing our economy, you have to reindustrialize. That is your transportation system. That's your manufacturing capacity. Chips, and to build semiconductors here and to rebuild, our capacity to make semiconductors here. I just want to say on that front, every company was making a rational decision to make their semiconductors elsewhere, largely in Asia. And we as a country used to make 40% of our semiconductors in the country. We now make about 12%. Companies go offshore. But when everyone's doing that, you look around and you say collectively 92% of the country's semiconductors are made by one company in one country. And we have to say, this is a problem for the country. Wow. So you have to rebuild that capability here. And what does that take? That takes, manufacturing, that takes supply chains, it takes construction capacity, it takes talent. All of those as a piece, if we look at infrastructure, semiconductors, clean tech, all of that is talking about rebuilding capabilities in the country that are going to help position us for the 21st century to compete globally and also, I think, to prosper as a country.
So when we were preparing for this conversation, the phrase industrial policy came up a lot. And that's something that you're an expert on. You're an expert in industrial policy. That's why you're here today. That's why we're having this conversation. What is industrial policy?
So I think in the simplest terms, industrial policy is the use of tools by the public sector to incent investment by the private sector in particular technologies or industries that we deem as important for the country's national and economic security.
Okay, so the federal government has made a decision that these are the kinds of technologies or approaches that we need as a country for our national security and for economic development. And then they incentivize private companies to invest in the development and deployment of those technologies. Did I get that?
That's right. That's right. And also I should say that this happens at the state level too. It's not just a federal one. But when you're doing it at the federal level, you can really talk about national priorities in a way that we don't at the state level. And I think that what we've seen, again, take semiconductors and clean tech as examples, is that often that the private sector alone, the private market, ends up underinvesting in key areas of the economy that we know have strategic and economic significance for the country. So if 92% of your chips are being made by one company in one country in which there are geopolitical tensions, you might decide that we should come up with a broader strategy for the country. Now, our strategy, to be clear, is not to make all the chips in the US. Our dependence on Taiwan and TSMC will move from 92% to I think about 87%. So this is not a radical change. We will rely, our strategy very much relies on partnering with allies and others to build out capacity, and I think that exists, across all of the strategies for our industrial policy. But it is the case that, again, bipartisan support, that we needed to shore up a vulnerability for the country, and that is something that I think, in many ways, industrial policy has always existed. Perhaps it's been indirect or implicit. This is the Biden administration has been quite explicit about saying, this is something that we have bipartisan support for, and it's really time after decades of disinvestment in the country, which have left us, vulnerable in many ways.
And could you help us understand how we got to this point a little bit? So, this is not one of the questions I sent you beforehand.
That's
so
fine.
Sorry about that.
I love it. Yeah.
But I'm wondering, why did that disinvestment happen? And it seems a little bit like this industrial policy is a way of correcting, or maybe not correcting, but having the market lean in a certain direction, right? Economic activity concentrated in certain industries and towards certain goals. Why did that correction need to happen?
So if you look at our economy, and look over the last 40 years, we've had, good growth, not fantastic growth, but it's been a globalization of the economy. And so a lot of our firms have, successfully globalized, and through that process, we've built out, supply chains and opportunities in other economies. And as a result, companies are going to move assets and invest elsewhere. I think the problem for us has been that a lot of the incentives have in our system, particularly if you're a public company that's being judged on quarterly results, it's led to basically a short-term viewing of what's good for the company, but maybe not good for the country as a whole. So if you look at the hollowing out of our manufacturing base, a lot of the investment in manufacturing has gone offshore. Companies have prioritized efficiency, which is what you find when you go to lower cost locations where labor costs are lower, et cetera.
Environmental costs.
And environmental costs there may not be environmental regulations, all sorts of reasons that one might do that. And we've also had, as a result of that, increasing inequality. As we just highlighted in our book, the book I will shamelessly promote, The Work of the Future, Building Better Jobs in an Age of Intelligent Machines, which was the result of the work of the task force on the work of the future here at MIT. And this is a book I co-authored with David Otter and David Mindell. What we have seen is that while there's been growth for the country in productivity growth, that the benefits of that growth haven't been shared with everyone in the country. So the typical worker, starting in the 1980s over several decades, basically has had relatively flat, wages and compensation, and that's, that is also, I think, part of what's happened over the last 40 years. And we say, how did we get here? Well, we saw both moving of offshore of middle-class jobs like manufacturing, but we've also seen, lots of policies that have essentially weakened labor market institutions, et cetera. So here we are 40 years later. We have, very global companies. We have global supply chains, a lot of emphasis on efficiency. And what happens? We get hit by a global pandemic, which completely disrupts our supply chains, and we start to understand how dependent we are. Not just, it's one thing to be dependent on multiple countries and multiple areas for things, but to be dependent on, particular countries and particular areas. We have environmental threats. We've seen now in the last 2 years, 20 plus events, if you will, flooding, forests, et cetera, that are at least $1 billion each in costs for the economy. And then we've seen geopolitical crises. I can say that when we were working in the White House on the ports challenge, as you might all recall, lots and lots of ships hoping to get into LA Long Beach and waiting for a while. We finally, Christmas arrived, the gifts came through, hallelujah. Supply chains were working, at least better than we had been anticipated. Then we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and all of a sudden, a whole other set of supply chain issues. We have the tensions that have arisen between the US and China right now, around Taiwan and other things. All of these have basically exposed our vulnerabilities to being without some capacity in the country around whether it's PPE or semiconductors, areas in which we need some capacity in the country. And frankly, I think we're in a place not only where there's bipartisan support, but we're also in a moment of technological innovation where we actually can make some of these products and develop capabilities in a way that even 10 years ago you'd say would be very hard for us to do. So it is a real moment and an opportunity.
It sounds like around economic resilience.
Resilience is the key word. Excellent. Yes. So basically, what we've been
we didn't
trying
plan
to do.
That, by the way.
No, exactly. But if you were to look at White House reports, you'd see how do we incent again? How do we move the private sector to invest in resilience as much as they invest in efficiency? And often, I think companies have seen those as a trade-off. But what we really know is both are important. And resilience costs money. So you do have to figure out how are you going to create buffers in your supply chain? How are you going to, create redundancy? And part of that strategy, as we've seen already, this is not just anecdote, but I think has really been tracked, is that companies are deciding to invest locally and reinvest in the U.S., sometimes reshoring, invest locally in terms of moving things from Asia to Mexico. And so that is actually something that's happening and building resilience, for the long term.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So let's bring it back to the climate change topic.
Yes.
We're a climate podcast, so we might as well do that. So how do these bills relate to climate change broadly? And then another big question that, maybe I need to break these two up, but I'm just going to go for both of them and you answer them the way that you want to. So what is this approach for dealing with climate change? How do these three bills try to tackle that? And then how is that different to how policymakers have tried to tackle climate change in the past before these three bills?
So I think that first and foremost, the thing to say about how are these different is just the scale. I mean, we're talking about
These are different than
the past.
Stuff in the past.
Than the past, sorry, is the scale. I mean, we're talking about close to $500 billion, whether it's in tax credits or in spending, that's addressing this topic. So that is unprecedented, and that is, I think, bringing sort of a whole of government approach to this topic. The second one, I think, is the variety of tools and approaches to this. So this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. This has got multiple ways in which we're addressing the challenges that we have here. So some of this is, as I say, sort of supply push, if you will, providing funding, whether it's in the green banks or through a loan program, so that companies are able to find resources to help build and grow their new technology or adopt new technologies. The other part is the demand part, is all those tax incentives that are going to incent you as a consumer to buy your EV, or you as a generator of energy to generate more of that renewable energy, or you as a manufacturer of parts in a solar or wind farms to also make those investments. And that demand pull is, almost as important as the supply pushes, is the part that's helping people make that investment. And I think in the past, we've had a lot of, we've had both, but we haven't had perhaps the demand pull at the same scale. And also we have to recognize that we have, in the last decade, we have really made enormous strides in our renewable energy capabilities, right? And so what you want to see is the development of these new technologies, and the IRA is agnostic as to which technology you're going to get that tax credit for. If you can prove zero emissions, you're going to get that tax credit. But sometimes markets aren't ready for this. We have to develop the market. And so what we've done, you see what's happened with solar and wind, right? We've developed the technology, the price has gone down, adoption is going up, and that's what we want to see across, over time across all of these different technology types. So the tax credits help you pull that, and I think that that's a whole new area. The third thing I would say is that we have been very strong. Certainly the DOE has been, a real powerhouse on the R&D side for renewable technologies. Very clear efforts across, particularly with infrastructure and IRA funding, to move not just from R&D, but into what the other Ds, demonstration and deployment. And so that's where we have an office of demonstration. We're going to try and provide significant funding, which it takes to demonstrate some of these technologies at scale. And we're going to find ways to, for example, we have these incentives for consumers to buy electric vehicles. Well, are you going to buy an electric vehicle if you aren't sure that you've got, chargers along the route to get you from one place to the other? The funding, we've got billions of dollars going out to states to build out that electric vehicle charging. So it's about the deployment as well. It's about helping build the infrastructure that can help us actually make the transition in a lot of these key areas.
Okay, there's so much that you just talked about that I want to touch on. I'll start off by saying other kinds of climate policy that have been proposed in the past have been like carbon pricing, right? Or regulations on the tailpipe emissions. This is very different from that. There's it's trying to solve for a number of different issues at once. One, we're trying to solve for the issue of manufacturing in the United States. And as you said, there was a hollowing out of manufacturing, and we're trying to replenish that and build for resiliency and things like that. But then also there are certain technologies, low carbon technologies, that have not scaled in the way that solar has successfully scaled, that now we're trying to invest in and encourage that happening. And these bills are attempting to tackle it in all different sides, like build the market, but then also incentivize it. Okay, so I'm just trying to get my head around this a little bit. So the question that I have is, I wonder if solar is a good example of this, because you talked about how solar was invented here in the US. I think we talked about that in one of the pre-interview.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know if it was with me, but with somebody who did have spoken with that.
Was invented here, but then it's not manufactured here anymore. But then there was a success story in how it was able to scale and become the price that it is now. Do you see that as being a good example of a success story that now we're trying to replicate in the other technological areas?
I mean, I think solar is an example for a number of reasons of how this is a complicated market. So this has been a challenge for the U.S. Invent it here, make it elsewhere. Again, for cost purposes. And also, if we look at global competition, particularly China has spent enormous amounts of money to basically flood the market with their products and wipe out, competition. And as a result, the U.S. and Germany have had challenges, I think, in the solar area. But what's happened now is, again, through these investments that we've made, and what we're doing here now is, as you said, we're trying to build the tech. We've always been very strong at building the technology. Now we're trying to both build and shape markets here in this country. And we know that if we can shape the markets that we're interested in developing and provide these incentives, that actually we can build a market for our companies here in the U.S., not just our companies, but for companies globally. This has been obviously a strategy for international investors as well. So it's not just that we are trying to put dollars down that will build out particular type of technology with a particular goal. It's that we are now incenting investors and creating a market that makes it, worthwhile for those investors. But we know some of these, solar is in one place, hydrogen is not there. But we believe that we can actually build, over time, a capability and a marketplace for that. But it takes certain incentives. It takes, we've got so much private capital on the sidelines that I think with the right context is really excited to invest here. And these incentives are going to help those companies invest.
Okay, so before you use the term technology agnostic, what does that mean?
So it means that that these tax credits are not putting a thumb on the scale for certain technologies.
Meaning like solar or wind
right,
or hydrogen
wind or geothermal or hydrogen or that if you can prove that you're generating clean energy with zero emissions, you have access to these tax credits. And so it's trying to say, give everyone, nuclear, let's make sure we mention nuclear as well, an opportunity to build into their development timelines and their forecasting, et cetera, use of these tax credits over the next decade in that process. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't programs that specifically are geared towards particular technologies. So there is a program on hydrogen hubs, about $8 billion that's been put out in a competitive process for regions around the country to compete for about $1 billion to become hydrogen hubs in the country. So where you have your universities, your companies, et cetera, to try and build those specializations, build that capacity in the country. So that's obviously we're taking a bet on hydrogen there, and we have a lot of interest in that. But in general, the idea here is let's support all forms of renewable energy and help them get along that path. And it's a long path for us. Solar and wind are ready today. Nuclear, hopefully ready in the next couple of decades. Hydrogen, as well. But we have to take the long view given our climate goals.
So we have other episodes on hydrogen and nuclear if you're interested in learning more about those technologies. Can I just do a quick time check? I don't have what time is it? 20 minutes. Oh, geez. This is why we schedule our interviews for an hour and a half, because there's so much richness that we need to. Okay. So when you're trying to change behavior, one could offer a carrot or a stick, right? A carbon price could be said to be a stick. You pay extra for emitting carbon dioxide into the air. Are these all carrots? The tax rebates, that's a savings. Is that what's included in all of these bills?
So it is absolutely the case that these bills are very much leaning into more carrots than sticks. And I think if you take carbon tax as an example, and put aside the fact that was politically challenging to get across the finish line, we have to look at the challenge of climate as a global challenge, right? Whatever we do in the U.S. is good for the U.S., but it doesn't necessarily address climate as a whole. And so when you think about a carbon tax, what you're doing is saying, you're reduce in your emissions in these particular fossil fuel areas, and then we're going to and somehow that's going to going to increase your investment in the renewable side. But what happens, of course, is then in theory our demand for oil and gas goes down, and somebody else in the world market could buy it at a cheaper price. And does that really help us globally reduce our carbon emissions? Not really. I think with the way that the tax incentives are structured right now, we're actually saying yes to renewables. Lean into this, which helps our country for sure, but also helps globally, because what we hope to do is invest more in these new technologies. Invest in the innovation, which we're very strong at. Invest in the deployment and the adoption. And in that process, we actually reduce their cost, and we make them more accessible, and hopefully not just in this country but around the world. And they start to have a positive spillover effect for carbon emissions around the world. So I think that the argument for the carrots rather than sticks, I think, has been proven to be quite successful and encouraging.
Oh, so that's interesting. So we're 6 months out from the passage of the IRA and almost a little bit over a year out from some of the other ones. So is there evidence that this approach to climate policy is working?
I think there is. I think the most important evidence is really in the announcements that have been made by the private sector about investments in the U.S. And whether it's in electric vehicles, batteries, solar, whether it's in manufacturing, advanced manufacturing areas, chips, of course. We've seen commitments made there. I think overall the White House has identified over $400 billion of commitments made by the private sector for new investments in the country across this range of priorities, and that's really, I think, the telltale sign in terms of is it working, or do we see a path forward on this? Because it's not, the federal government cannot do this on its own. It's absolutely not going to happen. It's really about incenting the private sector and private sector investment. And so you see that, I think, is kind of the most direct way to measure this. Obviously, we're going to want to track exactly what's happening at state, city, and local communities, because in the end, we want to see not just, we want to see a climate transformation that is actually bringing everybody along and supporting, communities across the country. And so
I want to talk about that a little bit, because we're talking a lot about consumers, and right, there's like the EV tax credits and for different technologies in your home. And then you were talking about companies and incentivizing some of their actions. You also talked about how regions can compete to be a regional hydrogen hub. What are the opportunities for states or particular regions or cities inside of this? How can these bills affect them, or how can it help enhance their capabilities?
Well, I think that it's really important for us to focus on exactly how this is going to translate on the ground. That is actually where all of this starts to make a difference. Now, of course, in the infrastructure bill, 80% of that funding goes right to departments of transportation,
like state
broadband.
departments?
Yeah, states, to the states. And so then that will, that goes, that flows in ways that have historically, are well understood. The rest of the money, if it's not in tax credits as well, companies will be going and investing in places that they think where they can find the labor, where they can find the suppliers to build out, all of these EV batteries, et cetera. But I think in terms of how communities and regions are going to be accessing this, it's very much, in some ways, some of these things are competitive, and so we have regional partnerships that are pulled together in which the federal government says we need to see, we need to make sure that all communities are at the table, that you've got, your labor force plan, that you've got all sorts of ways in which you as a hydrogen hub are actually going to, win this money. Or we have things that are accessible to all communities that apply. So EPA has a climate pollution grant. It's got a certain set of money. Any community can apply for that grant and will be given that money, and will be awarded the funding and then is put in a pool for larger funding. So it sort of changes between the types of policies and what their intent is. But the point here is to very much try and get particularly into communities that have been left behind or that have been affected by negatively by climate-related events and pollution. And so there's a number of ways in which that's been built into a lot of these efforts. So for example, if you're going to apply for money from the DOE, you have to provide a community benefits plan. How is the broader community going to benefit from your award of this funding?
So as part of my work at MIT, I've done some engagement in different coal countries in the United States, or former coal countries, kind of transitioning out of coal just because it's not a viable economic product for the community anymore. So they're looking at applying for some of this funding. And the question that comes to my mind is, are these communities equipped to apply for some of this funding? Do they have the resources or the time to create a community benefits plan or these other things that are required? Yeah,
no, I think that's a real challenge. And that's always been a challenge, is how do we actually make sure that the places that need it the most get the assistance? I mean, I think the good news is, for example, in coal communities or fossil fuel dependent communities, is that there's particular funding geared towards those communities. They have been a focal point for the administration. And interestingly, there's also tax credits. The tax credits here are kind of stacked. There's a basic tax credit for, in the IRA for your, for production or for your generation. But you get an extra 10% if you use prevailing wages. You get an extra 10% if you create an apprenticeship program, and you get an extra 10% if you're actually investing in coal communities and other places like that. So there's an incentive system for them, and there's funding that actually provides, funding for planning. So how can they hire consultants? Can you hire?
That's such an important part of the process.
It is such an important part of the process, and it's one that is, you always feel like there should be more capacity, more. One thing we're trying to do, we're talking about at MIT, is how can we bring MIT students out into the field to be supportive and help with these communities. And every community is resource constrained. I think it's fair to say on a lot of this, in a lot of these cities and states. And so, what can we do as an institution with a lot of well-trained and smart students to get them out in the field.
Super passionate about making a real difference in the world.
Super passionate and want to learn how to do it. And now is the time. It's happening now.
Yeah. So I just have an infinite number of questions, but we will open up to Q&A soon. So start thinking about what kinds of questions you might have for Dr. Reynolds. And if you don't, I have some, but hopefully you do. But let's talk a little bit before going into the Q&A about the politics and the enabling environment for these. So these investments were not passed in one big bill. There were 3 different bills. I mean, is it a coincidence that these all came out at around the same time? Were they ever thought of together?
So it's interesting. So we were talking about this before, that in fact, so infrastructure has been something we've talked about as a country, trying to get that across the finish line, for a long time. So that, was certainly one area. But the other 2 have also been the other 2 areas of science and technology, sort of CHIPS, as well as IRA, all have constituents that have been pushing for them. So 2 of them were passed with bipartisan support, the CHIPS and Science Act and the Infrastructure Act. And then IRA was done through what we call reconciliation, which was, a straight vote by the Democrats. There were visions, I think, at the beginning of the Biden administration that some of these would be connected, but as it turned out, it was much better to separate them out in different ways. And we should mention that the IRA is not just a climate bill. It's got a lot more to it, but that's the way we focus on.
Well, I guess none of these are climate bills, really.
That's right. IRA is not technically a climate bill. That's right.
Yeah.
What I would say is that, it is the case that in any new administration, they see the first 2 years of the administration as the time that you set your agenda and you really try to look for getting legislative wins. And so that is what the Biden administration has done. And so that was done. Whether that was going to be done in, 1 bill, 2 bill, or 3 I can attest was not clear at the beginning of 2021. But that's part of the art of politics, is to run and get across the finish line what you can when you can. And certainly I think the fact that 2 of these were had bipartisan support was a sign that they had been, in the works for a while. Bits and parts of them had been in the works, and people really wanted to see them across the finish line.
Okay, so I know that you're not a politician and you're not a political advisor in this way, but I just have to ask some questions about the politics of it, because the first 2 were passed with bipartisan support, and
right.
The 3rd wasn't. The IRA wasn't. So what had a minority still, but like a strong minority of Republicans support the first 2 bills, but not the second one? Or sorry, not the 3rd one, not the IRA.
Yeah, well, infrastructure, we talked about, that's had bipartisan support for a long time. The country had desperately needed investment in infrastructure. And CHIPS and science, the primary unifying area there, I think, is the concern about China and the rise of China in terms of their technological capabilities and economic power. And so from left and right, there has been an interest in trying to shore up U.S. R&D as well as capacity in a geopolitically fraught environment, which is what we see right now with China vis-a-vis Taiwan. On IRA, I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that it was hard to get bipartisan support. The Republican Party hasn't been a huge supporter, at least in Congress, of climate legislation, and so that was going to be a harder. We knew right from the beginning was going to be harder. It also, by the way, included prescription medicine, provisions and other things. But I mean, how we get, I personally believe that if you were to look at the last 3 to 5 years and what we've seen in terms of climate disaster and challenges for this country and for the world, that there is a growing consensus that we need to do something. Now, whether that was going to result in getting Republican votes on the IRA, is a separate question. As it turns out, it was remarkably successful politics, and Joe Manchin came to the table and negotiated a deal which we should all be very proud of.
Well, I think we could have a whole other episode on the politics of climate policy and conservative action on climate change
Yes,
and
and
things
I
like
would
that.
not participate in that conversation.
And I won't ask you to today anymore. In this, we'll switch to another set of questions in our remaining few minutes we have before Q&A. So I want to look at the even bigger picture here beyond the U.S. Well, let's start with the U.S. and then think beyond the U.S. So I've seen estimates that this legislation could cut U.S. emissions by up to 40% by 2030, which is close to, but not quite the pace that we would need to be on track for the Paris Agreement commitments. But that's just the U.S. And to truly, really deal with climate change, we need the whole world to be on board. So does this legislation do anything to achieve that and affect the global approach to climate change?
Well, I think the legislation, in many ways, what it does is it perhaps provides a pathway forward for other countries to follow. And that would be, I think, in some ways, it sort of throws the gauntlet down and challenges other areas. So if you look at Europe, I mean, Europe was not happy, nor were some of our other allies, with some of the Made in America provisions around electric vehicles and batteries.
Because we wouldn't be buying from them as much?
Because it's got some provisions about Made in America. But the point is, I think on that one, the challenge is so enormous, and the work is so great that whatever we're doing in the U.S., there's plenty of room for Europe to do what it needs to do, and then there's plenty of positive spillover effects for both economies and hopefully for the world. Again, technologies that we develop and deploy here help advance those technologies, reduce the costs, and those are shared. Those are benefits that are shared elsewhere. I think independently of that, there is a large interest by the U.S., obviously, to be a leader in climate policy globally, and ways in which we're trying to work with partners and allies to prioritize this and find funding, whether it's through aid projects, whether it's through investment projects, in which we're actually working with other countries to advance their clean energy agenda. But in many ways, I think the U.S. is now back being a leader on this agenda and is looking for ways to work with allies and partners to advance this. If you look at, we did a trade agreement with Europe on decarbonized steel. We're looking at supply chain provisions which are going to call to task countries that are not following environmental regulations, or that are not adhering to our standards in terms of labor. Those are setting standards and setting the bar for how we believe we should move forward in terms of decarbonization.
I've heard, is it true that the European Union has come up with something that has a similar approach, like industrial policy approach?
Yes, that's true. Similar approach. Since that's right. They've come out with kind of their own version of this, and it's, I guess I would say, the private sector has not responded as positively as they wanted. I think they think it's the European private sector is finds it a little bit cumbersome. Maybe that's the word to use. But again, this is an iterative process. This is a great thing that they're discussing it. They're moving forward with their own plans, and the work ahead of us is so great that I think we will, over time, be making this transition, and then hopefully all prospering in a decarbonized economy. One statistic that I wanted to emphasize this idea of what's ahead of us, that the U.S., to meet some of our climate goals, the U.S. must build out 100 gigawatts of wind and solar alone annually through 2030.
Wow.
To hit our climate targets. And in 2021, we produced 28 gigawatts. Okay,
so we need 100.
3x every year, for the next whatever years, and then continue on. And that's just in wind and solar. So, this challenge ahead is significant. And I think we've put a great wind at our backs right now to ramp up our effort in this country, and hopefully that'll have positive spillover effects in other countries.
Okay, we talked about some things that are successes from these three bills, things that are working well, that have shown to have some movement already. When I speak with other nonprofit organizations in the climate space, something that they're really thinking about is how do we implement the IRA? How do we make sure the money gets out there, that it's making this kind of difference? You were talking about how we need to deploy more wind and solar. I hear a lot about permitting issues with deploying more wind and solar that's actually holding back some of the implementation. So what are some of the challenges that still exist? So given this legislation that we have, what are the challenges that still exist for us to reach the highest aspirations of these bills?
Right. I mean, well, that's exactly right. They are, what we've done is the first step, which is actually provided the strategy and the funding and the incentives to get the country on track. But now we have to land the plane and figure out exactly how do we do this on the ground. And a lot of, warranted criticism has come to what happens at the city and state level to try and get new projects approved. All the friction that exists in terms of building new infrastructure, right? We've got NIMBYism, we have this in housing.
And what's NIMBYism?
Oh, sorry, not in my backyard, right? Everybody
That's like a real
likes
thing,
that project.
right?
It's a very real thing.
Yeah.
People know this, certainly in housing. And we have a housing crisis too that is also, challenged here. So I think, and people have pointed this out, the White House is trying to provide leadership as well on how can we improve our systems this way. We have built-in, for good reasons, we have built-in precautions. We don't want favoritism. We don't want corporate welfare.
To different technologies or companies or regions?
To companies, if you're, in terms of processes for, we want to protect environment. We want to make sure that things are done right when they are built. But it also can make a process quite laborious. I mean, we're talking, time is essential here. So we're talking, within a decade, we really need to make some transformations. You can't wait a decade for some of these projects to happen. So I think people are experimenting, can you fast track things? Can we find ways to improve processes while still respecting, some of the concerns we've had over time? It's a process that I think we're going to find, I suspect we're going to see kind of where are the coalitions of the willing. And given the amount of investment people are willing to make, I think given the wind at our backs, I am hopeful that we're going to see cities and states find ways to really improve our systems, because it's a systems challenge.
Can you just say another couple sentences about the systems challenge? How is trying to reduce the emissions and prepare for climate change a systems challenge? That's a big question, but.
I love it. This is MIT. We think in terms of systems. So what do we mean by this? What we mean is that while we have created a system for incenting investment in particular technologies or products that are going to help reduce our emissions, what that looks like for a city or a state or a consumer has to be translated on the ground. And it doesn't happen overnight. You want to build a new EV battery factory, you're going to have to go through certain permitting processes, and you're going to have to go through a sort of environmental, provisions that states have, and this takes time. And the urgency of the moment may not be felt in the local governments and planning departments or whatever else. I mean, this is just the nature of democracy and our kind of laboratories. But what I think is possible is that those laboratories are going to have lots of incentives to actually improve the process. And so I think we'll start to see cities and states figuring out how do we accelerate investment in new areas. I mean, you think about hydrogen. Hydrogen, again, we're talking decades down the road. We don't have the pipes right now to actually transfer hydrogen. We have it for natural gas. We don't have it. That's going to require a whole new system of investment, and hopefully our infrastructure teams and our states and our cities are going to figure out ways that we do this. But we're at the beginning of that journey, and everybody's quite aware of of the challenges, and I think we're going to get kind of a lot of, as I said, a coalition of the willing behind how we do this.
And that's why there's such an emphasis on deployment, right?
That's right.
The new office of deployments. It's not just about incentivizing and kind of letting things happen, but really trying to push some of these.
It's an office of demonstration.
Oh, demonstration.
But the point is that all of what we're trying to do is actually lead toward deployment. So that's exactly right. Is that we need to deploy in this country. We have, now, as I said, sort of the incentives and the wind at our backs. We have the technology at our backs. We have a global landscape that is making it clear we need to be doing this. So right now, we have to figure out how we're going to do this on the ground and how we can learn from each other about doing this in the most efficient and resilient way.
Well, thank you, Dr. Reynolds. Typically, when we do podcast episodes in the studio, we go around my team and they ask their questions. But today, you're my team, so you get to ask questions. So, Aaron, how are we going to do this?
We have a microphone stand in the aisle there, and I'd love you to just line up and ask your questions one by one for Dr. Reynolds and maybe for Laur as well. Yeah.
So if you have any, go ahead for it.
Thank you, Tom.
Okay, well, thanks for what has been a great discussion. And as someone who's been hoping that the country would do something big on climate action and something big on industrial strategy, to see it come together like this has been just amazing over the last year. So I think the question, Liz, and you touched on this, I think, a little bit very, very early in your remarks, and I was just wondering if you could tell us a bit more about it, which is how should we understand the benefits of, I don't know if co-locating is the right word, but of having manufacturing and R&D in the same place? Is there sort of a feedback? Does it make a difference? Do we get better at R&D because we have manufacturing back in the country?
And could you also explain what R&D is?
Sure. So that is a great question, and one that actually MIT has taken on in great depth, more recently in its Production in the Innovation Economy project. So research and development is often thought of as something that happens in a lab with scientists at a bench or in a facility with folks in white lab coats, et cetera. And then manufacturing somehow is over there, is something you develop your small prototype, and then you're going to figure out how you're going to make it someplace else. And in fact, what we know for complex products particularly is that actually it's a very iterative process and it's not particularly linear. So you may be inventing in the lab, but you're also iterating in the manufacturing. And you're learning by doing in the manufacturing. And so when you cut out the manufacturing and maybe send that someplace else, you often lose that learning by doing. And what we often call is tacit knowledge in the process of iterating on a product. And so people would say that that's exactly what's happened in semiconductors, is that when we said, we're not going to manufacture these, and by the way, semiconductor fabs cost billions of dollars.
What are semiconductor fabs?
Semiconductor fabs are where we make the wafers that are of semiconductors, and they are, they're made in very large labs that are working 24/7. They cost billions of dollars, and so often where these fabrication centers have been in places where the country, the government, is willing to put in a fair share of the money to actually build that capability. But when you lose that, you lose then the iterations on that product. When manufacturing is you've got innovation not just in products but also in process. And so we have seen, I think, in other areas too, in clean tech, where we innovate, but then somehow the incentive system as well here, it takes time and money to build products, to build them at scale, and to build innovative, complex products. And historically, we've had an investment world that has said, we're going to leave that to the rest of the world. We'll focus on the design part. We'll let others, manufacture. And in fact, that comes back to bite us because we lose our capacity to innovate. I would look, for example, in the bio space. So in biopharma, we have a capacity to manufacture here. We have lost some of it, but there's in the vaccine work, in cell and gene therapy work. You want manufacturing nearby because you're innovating around that. But it's what's exciting is to see new types of manufacturing, robotics, 3D printing, which are using AI, which are now able to be, manufactured and scaled here in this country because we have advanced technologies that make us competitive to do that.
Anybody else?
Let me just, could I answer that question better? Should I do a second round on that one? Do you think?
Please, go for it.
I don't want to bore these guys, but I'm just thinking that, Tom, did that hit the points, or do you think we could clarify?
I hit it for me, yeah.
You're okay?
But yeah, if you have another way that you want to frame it.
I was just trying to make it really straightforward. Was it straightforward enough?
Yeah, I mean, what I heard from what you were saying is you lose a lot of the learning by doing. I mean, I'm just using your words back at you, but by separating those two parts of the system. And so you can become more efficient, you can become smarter, you can create better products, you can do it faster if you link those two parts of the process together.
That's right. Okay, so, good.
Yeah, I totally got that.
I've got a question over here.
Yeah, Aaron always has great questions. Go for it.
So you talked about how some of the tax credits manage to be technology agnostic by just saying, produce the energy we need, it's zero emissions, you get your tax credit. For technologies that are still in the research and development and maybe demonstration phases that are not particularly close to actually, earning those tax credits, is there any way to be technology agnostic about supporting those technologies that might be really important in the future? Or do we have to pick and choose and go like, okay, here's some money for building out hydrogen, here's some for, clean aviation fuels or geothermal or whatever. Do we have to pick and choose?
That is a very interesting question.
And if there's a way you can give us an example of what technologies that might fall into that category.
I'm trying to think because what you're saying is, how do we place our thumb in the R&D phase on these technologies? And I think the answer is yes. So let me see how to answer that. I think that it's fair to say with R&D, which comes at an earlier stage in the process, that we are investing in research and development in areas that we think are promising down the road. So there is some intentionality there. We are going to say, well, and we now believe we've had a program in hydrogen for 25 years, right? Which has been really important and funded research centers and DOE, national labs, et cetera. So we do pick and choose technologies. I don't think it's, but I don't think at that stage, I think we're really in an exploratory phase in which there's significant, miles to go before we get to the other Ds. And so I think that, those are clearly set by, priorities and agendas that are perhaps not agnostic in the same way that a tax credit could be applied. I think that's okay. I don't think there's, anything problematic there. I think we come, based on developments in public sector R&D and private, sector R&D, we start to see opportunities and we start to invest. I should mention I think in terms of R&D, I'm not sure I mentioned that, part of what the CHIPS and Science Act, the Science Act part does, is re-up our public sector investment in R&D. If you look at the percentage of research, both public and private, as a percentage of GDP in the U.S., it has fallen behind Germany, behind South Korea, behind Japan. And
these are research grants from the federal government?
Not research grants. It's the percentage we spend as a country, both public and private.
Oh, okay.
As a percentage of GDP, what we spend on research.
Okay, so that's inside of private companies, that's in federal labs, that's in universities.
And while our private sector has really held its own, the public sector part of that has actually diminished over time.
Okay.
And so what this CHIPS and Science Act does is re-up that investment. And to your question, the fact is, in the R&D piece, we have programs. We have programs in nano. We have programs in hydrogen. We have programs where we believe we should be investing. But we also have broad-based technologies where we want to make investments, and that's what the Science Act did, which was, pick, for example, advanced energy efficiency and material science as areas that we as a country need to advance. And so how we do that, where we do that, how we incent that, becomes part of our national strategy.
Great. So I have another question you have another question. You have a question.
Still too high for me. This is actually from Barry, who's running AV for MIT Video Productions. He asks, any advice for students that are interested in pursuing climate policy?
Oh my gosh, great question.
I came out of the White House in the fall, and I slept for about three months, and then I was back on MIT campus, and I thought, one of my goals is that every student at MIT would get out in the field and work on this broader agenda. That we, and faculty members too, that we can't bring enough resources right now to actually implementing this new legislation and doing it successfully. And so I hope every student at MIT is going to, when they graduate, get a job or do a summer internship. And there are so many ways to do this. You can be working, in state and local agencies or even at the federal government. DOE is hiring like mad to help at the policy level. You could be working with companies that are actually making investments here. You could be working with communities that are addressing some of their, climate issues. There's just so much opportunity right now and so much need. And I would say, you've got 3 months, you've got a year, you've got a lifetime. Find a way to contribute and find a way to help us really make this transformation.
And if you don't know where to start, then talk to some faculty, and they'll point you in the right direction. I have some. Yeah, of course.
I just have a question about, so these bills have been passed and they've been said they'll help the U.S. meet their climate goals. But do you foresee other bills needing to be passed, and is that possible in the future? Just curious what you think about the horizon.
So I think in the near term, Congress has, basically been busy and had a heavy lift over the last year plus. And so I don't think that there's major legislation on the horizon that would speak to this particular agenda. At the same time, there may be things, tweaks and fixes and additional needs on the regulatory side or on the trade side. There will be things that absolutely are going to be part and parcel of the agenda. Right now, I think the focus is on implementation. How do you translate a bill into notices of funding opportunities and then awarding money or getting money out the door? I mean, that's a process, and so that's going to be certainly what the near term is about.
Something that I've heard come up as a criticism or a concern around these bills, particularly the IRA, was that it was around giving, or a lot of the tax rebates would go to people who could afford EVs or could afford, to renovate their homes or things like that. So there's concern about tax rebates for the rich. Any comments on that?
I think that I haven't heard a lot of pushback on the tax rebates certainly on EVs this time around. They seem to be, I think is it $150,000 for a couple income in terms of access
in the EVs
for electric vehicles.
7,500.
Yeah, so 7,500. But
part of that's
income,
the battery, and part of that is the. I'm not. Yeah.
Right. So, but I think I haven't heard pushback on these tax rebates at the consumer level, that they're too high for the wealthy, et cetera. I mean, I think what's different is they actually, it's not capped, certainly for for manufacturers, right? So it used to be, the last time around, the car manufacturers were capped at sale of 200,000 vehicles.
And that went pretty...
And that went quickly. I mean, we are happily, I think, are without a cap, which provides enormous possibility here. And having just ordered my own EV, I can tell you there is a backlog in that supply chain, and so hopefully that will that will subside over time.
Another question I have, it's a big topic that comes up for us, was we run something called the Climate Portal. We get questions from people who want to ask MIT faculty and questions about climate change. And one of the questions we get a lot is around the environmental impacts and human rights impacts of EVs, lithium, cobalt, mining, and associated with the batteries.
Sure.
And there's also a big push, of course, to go off of lithium and to find the sodium and other kinds of ways to create batteries. So I was wondering, is there anything that speaks to that inside of these bills? Is there anything about domestic mining or domestic production of those kinds of materials, or incentivizing non-lithium or non-rare element resources for those technologies?
Yeah, so in fact, I mean, that is the reality that, again, has been, I think, laid bare by the last few years, which is the dependency of this country for critical minerals, rare earths, on other parts of the world, and in China specifically, such that we have started to look very actively to both opportunities in this country, but also working with our allies and partners. And I think that the incentives that have been created in the IRA, and some of the funding that's been made available through Defense Production Act, for example, specifically related to impacts from Ukraine, are encouraging. I mean, I think the Biden administration, is going to be first and foremost defending, in many ways, making sure that we're not going back to environmentally, precarious ways of mining, is looking to protect communities and, community interests. And is really leaning in on technology and technological innovation to figure out ways for us to mine, critical minerals and these rare earths in ways that are less, create less degradation.
Yeah.
And so that's where the incentives, I think, are about, that innovation. And hopefully, there's technologies for finding, separating out lithium in, oil and gas tailings and things like that. Like, what are things we can do that are going to be, helping us make this transition and, leading toward more responsible and better resources than we have now. And I think we have to also, not just in this country, but also with our allies and partners, make sure that's the path forward. But that is a concern. There is a voice. That voice is loud and clear also in the federal government. I'd say it's
the voice around
concerns about the environment and 21st century mining and will it be an improvement upon what we've had in the past in this country? And it just has to be. And I think Secretary Granholm has been leading the charge on that in many ways.
Okay, 2 more questions from me.
I hope you all are going, leave, because you do not have, this is going on for, a long time. I don't want to make people feel like they have to stay.
Well, they're big, they're adults. They can figure it out.
All right.
So 2 questions. One is, this is a different approach to tackling climate change than policymakers have made in the past. What have been some of the learnings that have, from previous mistakes or previous legislation that didn't pass, that these new set of bills have incorporated, like it's not deployment, it's the other word, demonstration, right? Like demonstration is kind of one example of that. Or are there some things that's come to mind for you, like, oh yeah, we kind of didn't get this right for a couple of decades, and now as we're thinking about crafting this legislation, it's been a little bit corrected for or attempted to be corrected for?
So a couple things come to mind on that one. First, on the politics, as we discussed earlier, it was really hard to get a carbon tax passed in Congress. But it is really easy for companies to use a tax credit and make an investment in a state, regardless of its politics, and create benefits for that state and for that community. So right now, the announcements, as I said, private sector announcements about investments that are incented by, tax credits or other parts of this, I think the majority are heading into what might, technically called red states, right? But the politics don't matter, because actually this is about jobs, and it's about investment and an opportunity in any part of the country. And it's about a clean energy transition. And I think that, to me, is a really important lesson, is to say, how can we, this is about an existential threat to our kids and our grandkids, and that should have no political color. And if you make it a tax credit that can go anywhere with any, in any place, you sort of remove, in many ways, the politics of that, and that seems to be positive. And then the other one, which is absolutely a learning, but also reflects where we are in terms of our technological development, is this emphasis on demonstration and deployment. So a lot of people would say that the Department of Energy has historically been really about R&D, early stages of so many of these technologies, investing in those through the national labs, developing technology to a point where, hopefully the private sector picks up and runs with it. Now we're really putting money behind demonstrating those technologies at scale, because that's what it takes. And of course, when you're demonstrating, in the electrification of, systems, you need significant funds, hundreds of millions of dollars, which the private sector, without that, without some de-risking of that technology, isn't going to do. And so I think there's been a huge emphasis on investing in the de-risking. And in fact, the Department of Energy has put out a whole set of reports called Liftoff, I believe, which is all about not just the technology development, and which we usually we measure. Where is the technology? We look at these technology readiness levels, TRL. Where are they? Well, actually, right now, DOE is really emphasizing the adoption readiness levels. Where is the market for this technology? And these reports actually provide roadmaps on what does this look like for hydrogen? What does this look like, for nuclear? And I think that emphasis, all of a sudden we're shifting our emphasis because we can and we should. And those are living, documents that are going to be updated and evolve over time, because that's a changing landscape. The other part that I think can't be underemphasized is, the focus on getting the private sector to invest. So, we're facing, headwinds, I think, with the economy, and will we have a recession, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, the investment in clean tech, the investment, the willingness to continue to put money in new technologies and in promising technologies, knowing that, again, we are shaping a market, the demand is going to be there, is strong. And as I said before, I'm part of an investment firm called Unless. Unless we invest in this industrial transformation, we won't reach our climate goals, et cetera. And we're seeing, a lot of enthusiastic support for startups and for investment in clean tech, in advanced manufacturing technology, and everything that's going to help us make this transition. And so I think that emphasis really on letting the private sector see, the path forward, and why investing is going to have returns for them and positive outcomes, is also a key part of why there's so much emphasis on the demand pull in this legislation.
Is there anything that we didn't cover today that you think that we really should?
Let me see. I guess I would just emphasize that that I think that what we're embarking on now, you just really can't overstate the significance of it and the importance of it for this country, at the very least. And what we need to understand is that we're all part of making this transition happen. So I can talk about that with my MIT hat on, or with a government hat or investor hat, but I would just want people to understand that, in any way, in any, that we're all, invested in making this a success. And we're going to see, I think, a profound transformation and a real opportunity to put the country on a new trajectory, and a trajectory that is, addressing our climate concerns, addressing our national economic security, but also addressing our issues with inequality and with, providing opportunity for everyone across the country, and that this is a transformational moment, and it sounds technical, and it sounds caught up in legislation and dollars and tax credits, but in the end we're moving toward a different place, and that place is going to be better for everyone in the country. So I hope we can really work together on making this happen.
Well, that's it for our interview today. To hear and to share the 15-minute-ish version of this conversation, you can subscribe to TILclimate on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to learn more about the topics that we talked about today, we'll post more resources on our show notes section at tilclimate.org. And as always, we'll be creating an educator guide associated with this to help educators teach about climate change and/or policy in the classroom. TILclimate is produced by the MIT Environmental Solutions Initiative at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. David Lishansky is TILclimate's editor and producer. Sylvia Scharf is our climate education specialist. Alana Hirschfield, who's in the back right here, is our climate communications coordinator. The music is by Blue Dot Sessions. Michelle Harris will likely be our fact checker. I'm your host and producer, Laur Hesse Fisher, and Aaron Kroll is our associate producer. He also did our artwork and put on this event, so a round of applause for Aaron. Dr. Elisabeth Reynolds, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation today.
It's been a great pleasure, Laura.
And thank you for listening. That's it.
Thank you all.